Hello, my name is Maria Madis and I am delighted to welcome you back to the Family and Life Academy and to the fourth lesson of our course on abortion. The course is made up of 6 lessons presented by 3 teachers, Dr. Greg Pike, Anne Farmer and John Smeaton. So far, Dr. Greg Pike has presented data from some of the best scientific studies in recent decades to demonstrate the humanity of the unborn from conception. John Smeaton has explored the universal principles of natural and divine law to show why abortion is one of the greatest evils in history. And Anne Farmer has delved into eugenics and its relation to legalized abortion. All previous lessons are available on the Family and Life Academy website for you to watch and re-watch anytime. In this fourth lesson, John Smeaton unwraps the main tactics of the worldwide abortion revolution. John Smeaton is already familiar to the participants of our academy. He has been active in the pro-life movement for over 50 years on both national and international level. He's a co-director of Voice of the Family, who has also launched this Family and Life Academy platform for online formation. At the end of the lesson, as usual, Mr. Smeaton will answer any questions you may have, which you can put in the chat window at any time during the lesson. I will now hand you over to John, who will explain the diverse strategies which are being used to dehumanize unborn children and attack marriage, the family, and the innocence of children. Please, John.
Thank you, Maria. During this lesson, I will highlight 9 tactics in the abortion revolution. Firstly, attacks on the innocence of children. 2, attacks on parents as the primary educators of their children. 3, building alliances with leading officials of the Catholic Church. 4, flagrant breaking of the law. 5, the promotion of lies concerning the incidence of backstreet abortion. 6, promoting confusion about when human life begins in the womb. 7, going to absurd lengths to hide the humanity of the unborn child. 8, focusing on emotive, hard cases to promote the legalization of abortion. And 9, the promotion of slogans which are contrary to reality and common sense, but which appeal to popular feeling and are in tune with the modern secular age. Before describing these tactics in more detail, I need to say something about the historic roots of the abortion revolution. In my earlier lesson on the evil of abortion, I highlighted the contradiction between, on the one hand, solemn universal human rights agreements upholding the right to life, including the right to life of unborn children, and on the other hand, the establishment of an apparently ceaseless abortion massacre worldwide, the most murderous tyranny humanity has ever seen in virtually every country of the world. This abortion revolution can only be fully understood in the context of a wider rebellion against God and his church, a rebellion fueled by man's spiritual pride and unruly passions, which make him reject the laws of God infallibly taught by his church. The self has taken the place of God, in whose image human beings are made. This wider revolution has a long history. For a deeper understanding of that history, I recommend that you read Revolution and Counter-Revolution by the great Brazilian intellectual Plinio Corrêa de Oliveira, a seminal study of the revolutionary process going back as far as the 14th century. In that study, on page 22, Plinio Correa de Oliveira writes, and I quote, "Pride and impurity are the causes of the spirit of revolt that propels man along the path of the revolution." In her book, The Global Sexual Revolution, page 16, the German writer and sociologist Gabriel Kubi explains, "Those who have themselves become enslaved to their urges and have the power to forge them into ideological and political tools for creating an autonomous sexualized people blazed the trail to personal and social chaos for their contemporaries." End of quote. The sexual revolution of the 1960s was a revolution against the natural and divine institution of marriage, the foundation of the family, elevated by God to the dignity of a sacrament for the purpose of welcoming children into the church. Statistics of secular governments demonstrate that marriage as an institution protects children, both born and unborn. For example, in the UK, babies conceived outside of marriage are about 4 to 5 times more likely to be aborted than those conceived inside marriage. Roberto de Mattei, the Catholic historian and author, in a lecture, A History of Revolutions and Their Consequences for the Family, which you can find on the Voice to the Family website, said, and I quote, "The most violent attack that the family has ever undergone in the West was with the Cultural Revolution of 1968, a revolution against the family conducted in the name of sexual liberation. The act of procreation," Roberto de Mattei said, "is the object of anti-Christian hate, because this affirms that man has an end which surpasses him. The negation of procreation turns Christian morals upside down," he says, "and affirms the principle that sex is the ultimate end of man." This error, that sexuality is supreme in human nature, has led to the acceptance and promotion of contraception worldwide, the legalization of abortion, marriage breakup and the legalization of divorce, the emergence of gender ideology, the legalization of same-sex relationships and sex education, including the provision of contraception and abortion to school children without the knowledge and consent of parents. Note Roberto de Mattei's observation concerning the Cultural Revolution of 1968. The act of procreation is the object of anti-Christian hate. Nowhere is this more transparent than in the first tactic of the pro-abortion revolutionaries I'm mentioning this evening, the assault on children's innocence through relationships and sex education. Indeed, the first two tactics of the pro-abortion lobby I want to highlight in this lesson are the promotion of policies which set out to destroy the innocence of children and the removal of parents as the primary educators of their children. And these two tactics are intimately connected, in particular in national and international policies promoting and enforcing relationships and sex education throughout the school years. Relationships and sex education includes the provision of contraception and abortion to underage children without the consent of parents. By this means, the pro-abortion lobby seek to make the abortion revolution permanent, embedding the abortion culture in the souls of future generations. As early as 1945, C.P. Blacker, the secretary of the Eugenics Society from 1931 to 1952, advocated school sex education, enforced family planning, abortion, sterilisation, and easier divorce, as Anne Farmer, who presented the last lesson, records in her scholarly book, By Their Fruits, on page 342. His aim was to discourage parenthood amongst the socially irresponsible or eugenically undesirable. In 1967, the British Parliament passed both the Family Planning Act, which allowed birth control clinics to advise unmarried women, and the Abortion Act, which quickly led to virtual abortion on demand. Also, in 1967, Brooke Advisory Centres broke the law by providing underage children with contraceptive advice. I'll return to this point later. In 1974, Britain's Department of Health and Social Services issued a memorandum of guidance advising doctors that they could provide contraception to girls of whatever age without parental consent or knowledge. In 1977, the same British government department published a memorandum of guidance advising doctors that they could refer underage girls for abortions without parental knowledge or consent. In 1984, an English mother, Victoria Gillick, challenged this government guidance. Victoria Gillick's appeal was successful, and for 10 months it became unlawful for doctors to provide contraceptives to underage girls without parental knowledge or consent. During this 10-month period, the pregnancy rates for under 16s remained unchanged, while the total number of pregnancies actually declined slightly from 9,096 to 8,829. Also, in 1984, Lady Helen Brooke, whose organisation Brooke Advisory Centres, as I mentioned, broke the law in 1967 by providing birth control advice to underage children. Lady Helen Brooke wrote a letter published in the Times on the 10th of December 1984 in which she said, and I quote, "From birth to death, it is now the privilege of the parental state to take major decisions, objective, unemotional. The state weighs up what is best for the child." In 1985, the House of Lords, nowadays known as the Supreme Court UK, overturned the Court of Appeal's judgment in the Victoria Gillick case after the government appealed. The House of Lords reinstated the previous policy allowing doctors to provide contraceptives to underage girls, albeit insisting that secrecy from parents should be, quote, most unusual, unquote, and that doctors should only withhold information from parents, quotes, in the most exceptional cases. In January 2006, a Mrs. Sue Axon, the mother of two teenage daughters, lost a high court battle for parents' right to know whether girls under the age of 16 were being advised on obtaining an abortion. The provision of both contraception and abortion to so-called competent children at school without parental knowledge or consent is now recognised public policy in Britain. As the Department for Education and Skills put it in a letter on the 12th of April 2006, all young people can access advice and treatment without their parents being informed, so long as they are judged competent to understand the implications of the proposed advice and treatment, adding, confidentiality is not absolute. In 2011, at the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations in New York, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, the Population Council, and other pro-abortion groups held a meeting to launch a worldwide curriculum of so-called comprehensive sex education entitled It's All One Curriculum. The project was funded, amongst other bodies, by the British government and the United Nations Fund for Population Development. On page 231 of that document, teachers are urged to encourage young people to join movements for social change and to organise youth-led networks for, quotes, sexual and reproductive rights and services, a term understood by powerful Western nations to mean legal access to abortion on demand. In the same document, teachers of young children are told that self-abuse is a human right. They say, and I quote, sexuality may be expressed by oneself. Sexuality expressed alone can be a source of pleasure and meaning in life. It can enhance happiness, well-being, health, and the quality of life. That's on page 84 of It's All One Curriculum. So the first two tactics I've highlighted in the worldwide abortion revolution are the assault on children's innocence and the removal of parents as the primary educators of their children. There's another tactic which historically is closely connected with these, namely, the enemies of life seek to build alliances with leading figures and bodies in the Catholic Church. The purpose of such alliances is to subvert the authority of infallible Catholic teaching on the inviolable dignity of every human being. Following the House of Lords' 1985 decision permitting doctors to provide contraceptives to underage girls without parental consent, the Catholic Primate of England and Wales, Cardinal Basil Hume, bowed to the decision of the House of Lords instead of firmly opposing it. He thereby put in place a Catholic ecclesiastical policy permissive of the secret provision of contraception to underage children in school without parental knowledge or consent. In a letter to the Minister of State for Health, Barney Hayhoe, of the 1st of November 1985, Cardinal Basil Hume wrote, and I quote, I note that Lord Scarman, in his judgment, required, among other things, a considerable degree of maturity of understanding in young people before he would allow the doctor to act without parental involvement. He maintained, the Cardinal said, that only with such understanding would it be possible for a child's consent to have sufficient validity so as to be given the protection of medical confidentiality. Cardinal Basil Hume continued, Lord Fraser required this and 4 other conditions before allowing the exercise of medical discretion in this matter. It is our concern that these safeguards should not be circumvented in practice. I recognise, the Cardinal said, that there are cases of emergency and family breakdown when restoration of good relationships between parents and children cannot be achieved at once, or when they may have to give way to formal arrangements for others to take over parental functions and duties. And I would remind you, this is all about the provision of contraception to underage children, a policy that led very quickly to the provision of abortion. In 2010, Britain's Labour Party government endeavoured to pass legislation making relationships and sex education compulsory in English schools. On the 23rd of February 2010, Mr. Ed Balls, the Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Family, was speaking on the Today programme, a flagship news programme of the BBC. Mr. Balls said, and I quote, "If you are currently a Catholic school, you could choose to teach children only that contraception is wrong, homosexuality is wrong. That changes radically with this bill." Mr. Balls continued, "The Catholic faith school can say to their pupils, we believe as a religion contraception is wrong, but what they can't do is therefore say that they are not going to teach them about contraception, how to access contraception, or how to use contraception. What this changes," Mr. Balls said, is that for the first time, these schools cannot just ignore these issues or teach only one side of the argument. And he went on, "They must give a balanced view on abortion. They must give both sides of the argument. They must explain how to access an abortion, and the same is true on contraception as well." Mr. Balls went on to emphasize, and I quote, "To have the support of the Catholic Church and Archbishop Nichols in these changes is, I think, very, very important. It's a huge step forward." Ultimately, the government's bill in 2010 to make relationships and sex education compulsory failed because of lack of parliamentary time and because of the concerted efforts of its opponents. However, 7 years later, under a Conservative government, similar legislation became law with the backing of the Catholic bishops of England and Wales. The Catholic bishops' policy of support for the government's relationships and sex education guidelines was of great political importance for the government of that time. Their support was emphasised in a statement from Nick Gibb, the Minister for School Standards, in a House of Commons debate entitled Parental Involvement in Teaching Equality Act on the 25th of June 2019. And Mr. Gibbs said this: "The guidance was carefully crafted to build the widest possible consensus for this policy, which is why it went through this House with an overwhelming majority and the other House without a division." Mr. Gibb continued, "Those people who are opposed to it are at the other end of that consensus. I'm afraid that it is unlikely that we will bring those extreme ends of the debate into that consensus." He was referring here to parents who were opposing what was being proposed. "But I'm very content," he said, "that we have secured the support of the Catholic Church for the guidance we have created." In a 2020 article for Voice of the Families magazine, Counts Marie, Dr. Tom Rogers explained in full the exact nature of the Catholic bishop's support for the government, which included welcoming as, quotes, "compatible with the Catholic model curriculum," unquotes, the government's final draft guidance on compulsory relationships and sex education. This document presented abortion as an option to which pupils must be signposted without any reference to parents, and it reaffirmed in an intimidatory way the obligation of schools to teach LGBT content. Now, the importance for the abortion revolutionaries in building an alliance with the Catholic Church can also be seen in their assiduous, in the United Nations, I should say, assiduous courting of Pope Francis to gain his support for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In April 2015, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon travelled to Rome to open a Vatican conference on environmental issues. According to the National Catholic Reporter, Ban Ki-moon said, "The reason I'm coming to the Pope is that now I need moral support." 2015, the United Nations leader said, was a year for global action on climate change and achieving more sustainable lifestyles. In September 2016, Pope Francis published a message for the celebration of the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation, in which he said, and I quote, "The protection of our common home requires a growing global political consensus. Along these lines, I am gratified that in September 2015, the nations of the world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and that in December 2015, they approved the Paris Agreement on climate change." End of quote from Pope Francis. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were endorsed by the Paris Agreement on climate change and very much welcomed by Pope Francis, call on member states to, and I quote, "ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services, including for family planning, information and education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs." The term, quotes, "access to reproductive healthcare services" is defined by the United Nations Population Fund as including access for all to, and I quote, "the safe, effective, affordable, and contraception method of their choice." Furthermore, the term reproductive health care is used by many powerful governments throughout the world, including by President Biden's administration in the US, to refer to access to abortion. And the term universal access includes access to reproductive healthcare services for all, including adolescents, according to the UNFPA. And adolescence, in its turn, is defined by the World Health Organization, a UN body, as, and I quote, "the phase of life between childhood and adulthood from ages 10 to 19. This kind of extremely dangerous alliance with revolutionary tendencies on the part of Catholics is not a new phenomenon. Pope Pius IX powerfully explained its dangers in a letter to the president and members of the St. Ambrose Circle of Milan of March the 6th, 1873, in which he wrote, and I quote, "Although the sons of this world be wiser than the sons of light, their snares and their violences would undoubtedly have less success if a greater number of those who call themselves Catholics did not extend a friendly hand to them. Yes, unfortunately, there are those who wish to walk in agreement with our enemies, who try to establish an alliance between the light and Catholic doctrines, which, based on the most pernicious principles, adulate the civil power when it invades spiritual things and urges souls to respect or at least tolerate the most iniquitous laws, as if it had not been written absolutely that no one can serve two masters." Pope Pius IX continued, "They are certainly much more dangerous and more pernicious than our declared enemies, not only because they second their efforts, perhaps without realizing it, but also because by maintaining themselves on the extreme limit of condemned opinions, they take on an appearance of integrity and irreprehensible doctrine, beguiling the imprudent friends of conciliations and deceiving honest persons who would revolt against a declared error. For this reason, they bring about a dividedness of mind, rend the unity, and weaken the forces that should be gathered together against the enemy. End of quote from Pope Pius IX. A fourth tactic of the pro-abortion revolutionaries is to break the law flagrantly in order to bring about social and policy changes which are permissive of contraception and abortion. I'm going to return here again to the Brooke Advisory Centre's illegal provision of contraception and abortion to children under the age of consent in Britain in 1967, because it's a good example of how this tactic works in the abortion revolutionary process. So please bear with me while I recap a little on what I explained earlier. One, Brooke Advisory Centres, birth control centres, which were first established in Britain in 1964, began advising girls under the age of consent in 1967, and this was against the law. The British government subsequently intervened in 1974, restoring a semblance of order, as it were, by advising doctors that they could provide contraception to girls of whatever age without parental consent or knowledge. And in 1977, the same government said that doctors could provide underage girls with abortions without parental knowledge or consent. Ultimately, the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court UK, confirmed the lawfulness of the government's policy, albeit saying that secrecy from parents should be most unusual. Lady Brooke and her Brooke Advisory Centres therefore set the target by breaking the law, the provision of contraception and abortion for underage children without parental knowledge or consent. They set that target, and ultimately the target was achieved. The General Medical Council, the independent regulator for doctors in the UK, now makes it clear that the House of Lords decision applies to the provision of both contraception and abortion to underage girls. Breaking the law was the tactic used by Henry Morgentaler, who challenged the Canadian abortion law by publicly announcing in 1973 that he had performed more than 5,000 abortions at his Montreal clinic. The judicial process began and ended in the Canadian Supreme Court in 1988, when abortion was made completely lawful. And in London, England, in 1938, a gynecologist named Alec Bourne tested the laws by performing an abortion on a 14-year-old girl who had apparently been raped by several soldiers. According to the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, in their publication A Way of Life, Alec Bourne gave himself up to the police, was charged with an illegal abortion, and pleaded not guilty on the basis that the girl's mental health would have been adversely affected by giving birth. The judge invited the jury to decide whether Dr. Bourne's declared intention amounted to preserving the life of the young woman. The jury acquitted him, and the case was never appealed. The effect of the Bourne case was to authorize abortion to prevent damage to a woman's physical or mental health, a test which became interpreted more and more liberally. The influence of the case extended far afield to Commonwealth countries such as Australia. Alec Bourne himself eventually became appalled at the results of his case, and he became a founder member of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. Thus far, In this lesson, therefore, I've mentioned 4 tactics used in the worldwide abortion revolution: assaults on the innocence of children, attacks on parents, the primary educators, and replacing parents with the state, building alliances with leading bodies and figures in the Catholic Church in order to subvert the authority of the Church's teaching on the inviolable dignity of every human life, and flagrant breaking of the law, with the effect that the lawbreaker's activity is ultimately justified by becoming public policy. One of the most authoritative commentators on the tactics used in the worldwide abortion revolution is or was Dr. Bernard Nathanson. Dr. Nathanson, 1926 to 2011, was the co-founder of the National Association for the Repeal of the Abortion Laws, NARAL, in the United States, and he was once much quoted as the most militant abortionist doctor in America. The great change in his attitude to abortion came about through his work in perinatology, a branch of medicine that focuses on managing health concerns of the mother and child prior to, during, and shortly after pregnancy. He wrote a number of books, including Aborting America, in which he openly confessed that in order to gain sympathy for their cause, the pro-abortion lobby deliberately set out to manipulate public opinion, to misquote figures, and to tell outright lies. In Aborting America, on page 193, Dr. Bernard Nathanson writes, "How many deaths were we talking about when abortion was illegal? In NARAL, we generally emphasized the drama of the individual case, not the mass statistics. But when we spoke of the latter, it was always 5 to 10,000 a year, that is, women dying following illegal abortion." And he adds, "I confess I knew the figures were totally false." And in his book, The Abortion Papers, on page 41, published in 1983, Nathanson cites Dr. Thomas Hilgers, Associate Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Creighton School of Medicine in Omaha. He pointed out that and I quote, "the actual number of women dying when abortion was illegal in the 25-year period prior to the US Supreme Court authorizing abortion averaged 250, and the highest figure for any one year was 388 in 1948. An even more startling example of the lies told on backstreet abortion concerns Portugal. On November the 9th, 1982, the Times newspaper in London published a story which was also widely covered in the media throughout the world. And the story was that illegal abortions in Portugal caused the death of 2,000 women a year. However, according to the World Health Organization statistics, only 1,887 women in their main childbearing years, 15 to 44, died from all causes in Portugal in 1982. Clearly, the 2000 figure was pure fantasy, plucked out of thin air. In the final analysis, of course, the backstreet abortion argument in favor of legalizing abortion is fallacious. Abortion is a lethal act of violence directed at an innocent child in his mother's womb. No rational person would call for the legalization of child abuse simply because the laws that prohibit it are incapable of protecting all children from violence. There are certain moral evils which can never be tolerated, still less legalized, and these moral evils include the killing of the innocent. In Confessions of an Abortionist, Bernard Nathanson writes about another tactic of the pro-abortion lobby, and I quote, "A favourite pro-abortion tactic is to insist that the definition of when life begins is impossible, that the question is a theological or moral or philosophical one, anything but a scientific one. Fetology makes it undeniably evident," Bernard Nathanson went on to say, "that life begins at conception and requires all the protection and safeguards that any of us enjoy." I pointed out in my lesson on the evil of abortion, modern science is crystal clear that a new human individual comes into being at conception. The absurd lengths to which the pro-abortion lobby will go with their tactic of hiding the humanity of the unborn child beg a belief. In his book, Abortion Matters, on page 37, the ethicist and lecturer in moral philosophy, Anthony McCarthy, writes, and I quote, "In 2016, an advertisement in the USA for Doritos crisps caused a stir as it showed a baby in the womb reacting to the prospect of being given a crisp, and then reacting even more strongly when the crisp was withdrawn. The advertisement was obviously intended to be humorous, but it created some interesting exchanges on Twitter. The official account of NARAL Pro-Choice America," Anthony McCarthy tells us, the leading pro-abortion campaigning group in the US, tweeted an extraordinary complaint that the advertisement was humanizing fetuses, a tweet that was rightly condemned by many who asked what NARAL thought the unborn child was, if not human. Another tactic which must be mentioned and which is universally used to advance the abortion revolution is a generalized focus on hard cases such as rape, disability in the unborn child, and the threat of suicide on the part of the mother. Each of those situations is covered in other parts of this abortion course, so I won't dwell on them now. I answer the argument concerning rape during the question and answer section of my presentation on the evil of abortion, which is lesson 2 of this course. And Farmer looked at the pro-abortion lobby's focus on abortion for disabled babies in her lesson on eugenics, lesson 3 in this abortion course, and the threat of the mother committing suicide forms part of Dr. Greg Pike's lesson 5, the next lesson on abortion and women's health. All of these tactics combine to create the moral crisis in which we are living. An abortion revolution which appears to be permanent, not least through embedding the abortion culture in the souls of future generations and through the apparent complicity of leading officials of the Catholic Church. A sense of chaos prevails when fundamental truths such as the protection of the innocence of children is replaced by the destruction of the innocence of children as a matter of public and ecclesiastical policy. And when the obvious fact of the humanity of the unborn baby, more profoundly understood from a scientific point of view than ever before in human history, is blatantly denied. Roberto de Mattei, the Catholic historian, comments that, and I quote, "One of the manifestations of today's cultural moral crisis is the gradual decline of what Plinio Correa de Oliveira, in the wake of St. Thomas Aquinas, defined as lumen rationis. Lumen rationis, of which the Vatican Council also speaks in the Dogmatic Constitution on the Catholic Faith, Chapter 4, is a natural light of the intellect that allows us to know and possess those first obvious on non-provable principles that are the common patronymy of all men at all times. Roberto de Mattei concludes, the extinction of the lumen rationis is a consequence of the extinction of principles. The way has been paved for gurus, quacks, and intellectual demagogues who appeal to people's feelings and to thoughtless motions of the human soul. Modern man's subjection to gurus, quacks, and intellectual demagogues, and that was the end of Professor de May's quote. So, modern man's subjection to gurus, quacks, and intellectual demagogues can be seen in the susceptibility of the overwhelming majority of people today to the deceptive tactics of the pro-abortion lobby, widely disseminated by the mass media. People's loss of the natural light of the intellect leads to their no longer knowing the obvious principles that have guided humanity throughout history. It leads men to accepting, without checking, pro-abortion propaganda, which is contrary to common sense and reality, but which is in tune with popular feeling in the modern secular age. Indeed, nowhere is this more evident than in popular susceptibility to the pro-abortion revolutionaries' tactic of using the rhetoric of choice in advancing their campaigns in favour of abortion. In their publication, A Way of Life, pages 49 to 52, the UK Society for the Protection of Unborn Children points out the absurdity of pro-choice rhetoric, in that the right to choose only applies to the pregnant woman. Her right to choose on her own denies any freedom of choice to the child facing death by abortion or to the child's father. Pro-abortionists define the woman's right to choose so narrowly that neither the unborn child nor anyone else is accorded any rights whatsoever. The child is denied the right to live, and the father of the child is denied the chance to prevent his son or daughter from being aborted. As a counterexample, take the fact that the father obviously has no right to insist that the mother has an abortion, although this is the tragic reality of countless abortions under the current regime, with coercive abortion a matter of increasing concern in the UK and elsewhere in the world. The reason that no such right exists, however, is that it would consist of the most inhuman violence to the mother and lethal violence to the baby. It's the task of the pro-life movement, Catholics especially, and of all good people of goodwill, to do what we can to guide our fellow citizens back to common sense and objective reality. Patiently to teach our fellow men and women how to use their God-given reason to see through the lies, the emotive slogans, and above all, the attacks on the innocence of children, the God-given rights of parents, and the inviolable dignity of every human being. These are values which are at the foundation of Christian civilization, infallibly upheld by the Catholic Church, which can be understood by people of all faiths and none. And, as I explained in my last lesson, are values which we as Catholics are especially called on by God to seek to restore at this terrible moment in human history.
Thank you, John. Another fascinating excursion to what we're facing. Thank you very much. Question time. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and we have quite a few questions. So I start straight away with coercion. Is it known, the questioner asks, approximately what the percentage of abortions are coerced in the UK? And can you recommend some good sources for this?
Okay. Well, the go-to organisation for evidence of coercive abortion is, in fact, the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, SPUC, in the UK. They have produced and are continuing to produce a huge amount of meticulously researched materials showing abortion coercion is all too common around the world. There's really excellent material actually freely available at SPUC's website, and you can certainly email the society and get more information. I saw one thing there, that the BBC had commissioned a poll which found that 15% of women aged 18 to 44, I think it was, had been pressured into having an abortion they didn't want. And then they've got, studies from the America, US, and Russia showing actually in the US a substantial majority. I think the figure was 64% of women who had abortions reported that they'd been pressured, they'd felt pressured by others. They also quote the American Psychological Association to a similar effect. I mean, it's important, this, because the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, it wants to raise public awareness internationally that coerced abortion is a form of abuse. And they also want to reach women who are being coerced or who are at risk of being coerced, and to signpost them on how to get help. Oh, sorry, another great source is BIOS Centre, bioscentre.org, and that's centre RE at the end. It's the English spelling. It's an international bioethics research centre, and they've just published a paper by none other than Dr. Greg Pike, one of the teachers of this abortion course. He's a fellow of the BIOS Research Centre. I think his paper's called Reproductive Coercion. And you can either watch him on the bioscentre.org website, or you can download a paper of his at a small fee.
Thank you. That's excellent. The next question is about Bernard Nathanson. Why did Bernard Nathanson make confessions about the use of false statistics and science? And did he come to regret these tactics, or if not, how did he justify them?
Oh, yes, he did regret it. In Aborting America, Bernard Nathanson said he knew the figures he was citing were totally false. I mentioned that, and he also said, as did others with whom he was working. But he said, in the so-called morality of the revolution, it was a useful figure to say that between 5 or 10,000 women were dying every year from illegal abortion, whereas in fact he knew that the actual figure was either 12 or 25 times less than that. He said that his overriding concern was to get the restrictive abortion laws, as he thought them, eliminated, and anything he could do to effect that was right. Did he regret it? Yep, he certainly did. Interestingly, in connection with that, he tells the story how he had a sort of instant conversion. I suppose complete turning point, I should say, because I think he had begun to think about the issue more deeply. But this instant conversion occurred as he put it, instant conversion, when he witnessed a pro-life people praying and trying to help women outside an abortion clinic, and he knew that they were risking jail and becoming bankrupt. And he said in his book, The Hand of God, where I think he talks about his conversion to Catholicism, that for the first time in his life, at that moment, he began to entertain the idea that there was a God who led him through hell and guided him to mercy. And he had a growing conviction, and this is important, that someone had died for him 2,000 years before. And he said that the moment he was converted, he just saw his past life as a sort of vile, evil bog. And he became absolutely convinced that he'd committed high crimes against people who loved him, because I think he aborted his own girlfriend early in his life, and those who didn't even, he aborted those he didn't even know. So yeah, he certainly regretted what he'd been doing.
Yeah. And well, an easy question for a change. Where can I read more about Alec Bourne?
Right. Well, one of our teachers, Anne Farmer, she's written a book which I've mentioned one or two times because it's a fantastic book. Yeah, if you can get hold of this book, you should. It is expensive at present. I think she's trying to think of a way of making it available more cheaply, but right now it's expensive. But you could actually get access to it perhaps through a library. I don't know how that works in different countries, but certainly in Britain it should be possible. Now, her book has a number of detailed references, both to Alec Bourne personally and to the Alec Bourne case. Her book, incidentally, is published by the Catholic University of America in 2008, CUA. Now, there is another source to which I've seen references, and it's the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. But I know when I looked it up, it cost £1,545 to buy, I think, or £255 just to see that particular article. But once again, now it'll be a very reliable and authoritative biography because it's written by John Keown, who's a most authoritative and reliable legal academic. So
Anne's book is quite affordable compared to this.
Yeah.
And just for the record, so Anne's book is called By the Fruits, correct?
Yeah.
So yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, very good. Well, we have time for one more question, I think. So there's a few come in, but yes, we have time for one more. So what do you think has caused the loss of all right reason in the abortion debate?
Okay. Well, in my lesson, I quote Plinio Correa de Oliveira, the historian, the Brazilian intellectual, the author of Revolution and Counter-Revolution. And he wrote, pride and impurity are the causes of the spirit of revolt that propels man along the path of the revolution. Well, pride and impurity are clearly very much in evidence in the secular world. One only has to open the pages of so-called respectable newspapers in any part of the world to see that that's the case. And pride and impurity are also very much in evidence within the Catholic Church. In my lesson on the evil of abortion, I referred to the fact that according to one poll, 89% of US Catholics approve of contraception. Now, they've rejected the church's teaching that the main purpose of marriage is welcoming children. Mutual love and fulfillment, the self, has come before God's command to go forth and multiply. And if children are perceived as a burden and can be avoided through contraception, it's really a small step to accepting that babies can also be avoided through abortion. And, you know, I mentioned also, I think it was 76% of Catholics in the US think that killing unborn children in certain circumstances should be legal, even though the church teaches that abortion is the direct murder of the innocent. Such rejections of the truth about the sanctity of human life is historically unprecedented, and it appears to have come about by putting self and selfish desires before God. And in this way, the selfish acceptance of abortion becomes both a symptom and a cause of a loss of reason. Because the situation's made worse by the influence of national institutions, the medical institution, the scientific profession, the teaching profession, all sending out the message, academia, that killing unborn children is okay. Their viewpoints, of course, are loudly amplified by the mass media. And I'm sorry to go on a bit, but added to this, you have at best the silence of the church, and at worst its complicity. The institution established by Christ to teach all nations and to guide people throughout the world to God and to heaven. All Souls Day 2022. The Bishop of Kerry in Ireland publicly rebuked a priest and apologized to the people after the priest concerned had referred in a sermon to abortion and same-sex marriage relationships as sins, and also it was a sin for the government to freely distribute contraception. The Bishop of Kerry actually said that the priest concerned was not representing the Christian position. Now, I think this has enormous impact, not only in the Catholic Church, but also in the secular world. It leads to a spiritual darkness. It leads to terrible confusion, a weakening of the power of reason. Put simply, if you can believe that it's okay to murder a vulnerable fellow human being in his mother's womb, you can believe anything, including the fallacious and emotional arguments of the pro-abortion lobby, which are designed to keep abortion legal throughout the world.
Thank you. One would almost wish a more hopeful note for the ending, but our hope as individuals and society is conversion, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it is how I ended my talk on a positive note.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I know that
Yes.
that would be the last question, but
yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, no, a great confusion and a big task for conversion. Well, thank you, John, really, for this very insightful lesson today. And thank you, everyone, who for your participation today. The video of this lesson, of course, will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website along with study notes in due course. And we look forward to seeing you for lesson 5, which will be presented again by Dr. Greg Pike, and which will deal with abortion and women's health. Heartfelt thanks once more to John, who will be back to present the final lesson called Historic Events and Key Figures in the History of Legalized Abortion. And we're looking forward to seeing you again for that. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all again for more lessons and courses at the Family and Life Academy.